So you want me to take over? Straight up from the beginning. Okay. So just.
Okay, well, then should I turn Howard around? No.
Okay. Howard. Oh, Howard.
And okay, I think we'll get started. I'm just going to press record on here. 1 second. So thanks everybody for coming out summer afternoon. Good showing. So I will first introduce Will briefly and also introduce the committee. And then apparently, this is my first center graduate that I've supervised, so heard about the poem idea, so I've got a poem here. And don't want to break tradition, very important. Will started programming in the 3rd grade, and he hasn't stopped since, I can assure you, even if he's not physically doing it, he's doing it in his mind. He thinks in code, and he studied math at Guilford College, and then studied artificial intelligence afterwards at UNCG. Joined FAU in 2010, joined my lab in 2013, and he has thoroughly upended the place. Much of what I am currently working on, I actually directly owe to the synergy that comes from working with a truly brilliant individual. Will has convinced me, and we're now trying to convince others that some very, very important progress has been made in terms of our understanding of the brain, particularly in coming from computational and theoretical neuroscience. So Will's going to tell us a bit about that. Dr. George, I'm blanking on the last name again. Clancy's, I'm very bad with names. Joined us also from medical physics, supervised a master's thesis recently using some of these techniques that Will is going to discuss that have very broad applications. That's one of the great things about them. It's not just about understanding the brain. You can also do stuff with it. So now we'll move on to the poem, and then I'll get out of your way. So this poem, as it says, by Richard Feynman. Bet you didn't know he was a poet too. And apparently he read this poem in his address to the National Academy of Sciences. I've redacted it just a bit, so my apologies to the original. They are the rushing waves, mountains of molecules, each stupidly minding its own business, trillions apart, yet forming white surf in unison, ages on ages before any eyes could see, year after year, thunderously pounding the shores now. For whom? For what? On a dead planet with no life to entertain. Deep in the sea, all molecules repeat. The patterns of one another till complex new ones are formed. They make others like themselves, and a new dance starts. Growing in size and complexity, living things, masses of atoms, DNA, protein, dancing a pattern ever more intricate. Out of the cradle onto dry land, here it is standing, atoms with consciousness, matter with curiosity.
Well, thank you very much, Elon, for that very nice introduction. And thank you all for being here today. It means a lot for you to take your time and come hear what I have to say. This has been an incredible journey. I started in this room a long time ago. When I think about the percentage of my life, it's almost scary. And so I want to just thank everybody who's been really helpful along this way to get to where I am and to help make this possible. There's a lot that I wanted to say. I think Elon's been incredibly helpful for helping me chop this down. Right? This would have been a 6-hour talk, but thankfully Elon intervened. So I'm just going to start in with a bold statement. Right? And obviously this is going to be too bold. But I'm going to make the claim that these ideas of sparse coding and compressed sensing are really going to help us understand a lot of things that have been sort of missing from the brain. People have been trying to build intelligent machinery for almost 100 years, and even much longer than that, we've been trying to understand the brain. What is it? How is it that it does what it does? And how is it that we can better understand this so we can create medicines and just help our overall condition? So outline, what am I going to talk about? We're going to talk first about neural networks. So this is a very hot idea right now. It's sort of in the current renaissance. We're going to describe sort of the reason for that and why it might be rather important. Then we're going to discuss this idea originally from 1996 called sparse coding. And so there's a couple of neuroscientists who originally were trying to figure out how is it that brain cells do what they do, and so they devised this idea of sparse coding. And it wasn't then until 2009 that some computer scientists sort of picked it up off the shelf and they said, hey, maybe we can use this in our little robots. And that has seen sort of an explosion in progress in this area. And thankfully, it's gone in both directions, not just from neuroscience to computers, but from computers to neuroscience. Then we're going to discuss this idea of a dictionary. And so this is going to be very key to this sparse modeling, is that you have a set of fixed signals called a dictionary. And it's interesting, having gone through this sort of subject, I've built my own dictionary for these ideas. And so we joke that we have a rich representation for the words I'll use today. And so I'll apologize if a lot of the words don't make as much sense. You'll think, well, dictionary is what we're used to. But so a lot of times these words will have slightly new meanings. Well, by the end, hopefully we'll have an idea of what this dictionary thing is and why it's a good idea. Then we're going to discuss something called a locally competitive algorithm. And so it's a very exciting class of software. You might have seen, there was a talk here a few months ago by Dr. Garrett Kenyon from Los Alamos. And so interestingly enough, that ties back into the Feynman quote. I didn't think about it until just now. But Feynman worked at Los Alamos. And that's where they have the LCA network is being run on the petascale computer. So we're very happy to say we've extended this in many ways, including getting LCA to create a dictionary, something that's never been published or shown before. Then what we're able to do is essentially take this architecture and rewrite it. We were able to find some evidence that when people measure actual biological neurons and they try to figure out how they fire based on the membrane potential, they found a mapping that was proportional to the third power. So we're going to explore what that means in relationship to these two things and why we're very excited to make this idea more biological. And that we can take a model that we know works from neuroscience, a model that we know is proposed from neuroscience, and then combine the two to accomplish the same goal in a more biological fashion. And then finally, something I'm very excited about is this notion of compressed sensing. And so this is a very new idea. Just curious, show of hands, is anyone familiar with this idea of compressed sensing? So a couple people, great. So this seems to be very exciting. When I first kind of came across this idea and it kind of clicked one day, I thought, wow, this is going to change more than just science. We'll be able to do a lot of different things. Basically, the way we measure things has changed. And almost any measurement, we can now go back and redo that measurement. And so not just in neuroscience, but in environmental science, and even in social situations where you'd want to measure even things from history. So here's Galileo, I'm sorry, not Galileo, Leonardo da Vinci, and he thought that your vision went to your ventricles. So we've come a long way since that time, and I would dare say that we're actually making some really good progress in terms of understanding the brain. So what are my contributions? Largely MATLAB. I would say I spent the bulk of my time developing MATLAB codes. I tried to make them as small and as concise as possible. Those of you that know me know that I think if it's more than 10 lines of code, you're probably in the wrong language. And so I tried everything I'll show you today, I don't think is more than 3 lines of code. Right? So there's some support around the structure, but in terms of the meat and potatoes, the actual engine itself, I tried to make it as simple as possible. I don't want to sort of import some library from Google that just does it all for you. I tried to show how everything was done from the mathematics. And so the contributions that I'm proud of that are original is extending the locally competitive algorithms framework to include dictionary learning. So we'll get into what this means and why that's important. The work that we were able to publish last spring is on sparse filtering and LCA video classification. So we're able to take videos taken from essentially what would be thought of like a security camera. And they had different classes of action, people walking, running. And then we tried to build a classification system modeled off this neural network that could then take unknown videos and try to determine the class. There's a person running in this film. You can imagine like an application around a swimming pool to make sure people don't run. Then we'll discuss this new algorithm that uses x cubed, that combines some of the ideas from LCA, but in a more biological fashion because we have evidence that it's been measured that this is what neurons actually do. They map to cube. And then finally, we'll look at this notion of compressed sensing and what this means, how we can compress a signal and sense it at the same time. And so this is very exciting because it's going to allow a lot of new applications, in particular in neuroscience. There's a lot of things we want to measure that you just get too much data. You can't handle it, whether it's an EEG, an fMRI, a genetic study. Sometimes you're just overwhelmed with data and we can't handle it all. So we're going to have to deal with that. So briefly, let's start with neural networks and talk about what these are. So originally, these ideas started in the 40s, in World War II, and the very first neural networks were actually objects. They were things. They were made out of stepper motors and resistors, and connections were sort of like a dimmer switch. And there was an actual motor connected to that dimmer switch, and when an error signal would come through, they would change the resistance of that connection. And so when you hear the famous perceptron project, perceptron was a particular thing. It was a contraption. Now these are simulated. And so we're in this brief time where we don't build the neural network itself, we just simulate it in a digital computer. And so everything I'll talk about today is just a simulation. But ultimately, what you'd want to do is you'd run this in hardware. And so the algorithms that we discuss, locally competitive algorithms, these are good at doing just that. You can build a computer chip that will solve that computer program directly. And so there's a number of obvious applications for this. I think the big one is going to be the self-driving cars. I was talking to a friend of mine and they said, oh, that's not going to happen. Self-driving car isn't real. And I said, but you can buy it at the mall. And you can, right here at the Boca Mall. You can buy a car that has autopilot. This is extraordinary, but they have, there's been tremendous advances in the graphics card technology, and largely the companies that are driving this is NVIDIA and AMD, the two graphics card companies, the companies that make the hardware that run video games. But that computer chip is fast enough to be able to take a car image, break it down into edges. Most of the talk will be concerned with how we create pictures like this. And then later we can create combinations of these to build up features. So we can think of this as being raw pixels. And then this first layer we can think of as frequent combinations of pixels. And so they're features that show up over and over. And so what we are going to argue is that this is what the brain is doing, is that receptive fields, that neurons are essentially trying to construct a representation like this so that they can make sense of the world. Just like a car enthusiast would be able to tell you the name of this car, there's now commercial products that can do just that. So people say, you know, this seems like a long way from where you got started. I thought you were studying MRI in the brain. Well, in a way, this does come back full circle. It was very hard for me to linearize this project. As you'll see by the end of this talk, I think very much in a web. And so if we look and see, you know, what does this web look like, we can see that this was a big result in 2012. So I remember when I came across this result, this was sort of a big deal at the time because this was the first time that a deep learner had ever won an image segmentation competition. And those of you that study visual perception know that segmentation is one of the classic difficult problems in vision. How do we know where the background stops and the thing you're trying to look at begins? And so this was sort of a watershed moment in that. And this is an image. This is called a serial block face scanning electron microscopy. So this is actually a small piece of nervous tissue that's been sliced very, very, very thin and then scanned with an electron microscope. And the task here is to determine the cell wall. Where is the actual cell wall and where is the cell body? And so typically the way this was done is you would have people do it. You would have graduate students or Amazon Turk, some sort of crowdsourced service, or just expert biologists, radiologist types that would have to go through and tell you where those boundaries are. And so for the first time in 2012, this was able to do it. And so this is in the area of what's known as connectomics. So this is small-scale connectome. And so if we look at this map here, this is a map by Jan LeCun. So Jan LeCun is a Bell Labs researcher that recently got hired by Facebook for a cool $1 million a year. And so it was he was sort of relatively obscure when this slide was made, but it just sort of goes to show you how these things have taken on tremendous industrial importance. So, this graph tries to connect deep learning, sparse modeling, and neuroscience, and I like this because I can find my way home here again and say, oh, connectomics, right? And so what we're going to try to do in this talk is chase through how sort of ended up studying sparse modeling. Namely, Shapiro and Elad has been very strong influences in this work. And then the one that's most familiar to neuroscientists is the Fields and Olshausen work. But we'll briefly look and discuss matching pursuit and basis pursuit. We can see compressed sensing coming in over here. We'll talk briefly about L1 minimization, but we can see some other popular friends. Backpropagation, convolutional neural net, and normalization has been very important for this work. But it really started back here in '62 with the Nobel Prize-winning work of Hubel and Wiesel, who, when they probed in the back of a cat neuron, they found these type of dictionary elements that we'll see in a minute. And then later this was extended to the neocognitron from Fukushima, and this actually worked very well at recognizing handwriting. Part of the problem with subjects like this is they've been reinvented a few times over, and each time that happens, they get new words. And so things that we'll be familiar with, like a V1 simple cell, this is going to have to map into something different, namely a sparse component. If we're talking in terms of statistics, or if we're talking in terms of coding, we call this a localized oriented bandpass feature. So I know Howard, this is what sort of Howard studies, this motion coding. So we have here MT, and that would relate to motion. And so when we look at